So hopefully I'll be able to break down kind of some of the things that I do. So yes, my name is Alex, and I'm really excited to be here, so a huge thank you for the invitation. Before we kind of go any further, I do want to just put a little bit of a warning out there today that we will be putting images of human remains on the screen here. So I will do my very best to kind of give you a little bit of a heads up before any particularly potentially graphic images are coming up on the screen, so that you can kind of decide if you would like to close your eyes for the time being. So I will just put a little bit of a warning there for you folks. But hopefully you will find this very interesting and not too disturbing from some of those images. But to start off the lecture, I have a couple questions for you folks. So who in the room here has broken a bone? So raise your hand if you've broken a bone. Keep your hand raised if you've broken a bone. Now, who here has had a dental x-ray? Keep your hand raised if you, okay, I see almost everyone, okay. Trying to think of something else that is unique about your bones. Really, one person in the room, this has never happened to me before. Usually everyone has their hand up at this point. So the reason I asked this, you can put your hands back down. The reason I asked this is because your bones genuinely do tell the story of your life. Any bone that you've broken, any tooth that you've had a filling, a cavity, if you've had x-rays of your bones or your teeth, the record of you exists skeletally. And the record of what's happened to you exists skeletally. And so that's why I decided to title this lecture, The Story of Your Bones, because they really do tell the story of your life. So, overview of the lecture today, we're going to talk very, very briefly about what biological anthropology is. I'm sure that you folks are going to find about this in a little bit more detail in your course, but I'd like to just situate where forensic anthropology sits in the umbrella of biological anthropology. So we'll quickly situate ourselves there. And then we're going to talk about forensic anthropology in the past, the present, and where hopefully my research will take it in the future. So that's just a little bit of an overview. So what is biological anthropology? So it is an umbrella underneath the umbrella of anthropology. So as you folks know, there are different fields within anthropology, one of those being biological anthropology. And then under biological anthropology are so many more options. If you're really interested in primates, you can study that in biological anthropology. If you're really interested in paleoanthropology, so that's human evolution, that's nested under bioanth. And then finally, my personal favorite and passion, forensic anthropology. So, a couple of really important points that I want to make now before we kind of dive further into the lecture, that biological anthropology does have a very interesting past, and some research in its origins promoted some unfortunate narratives. Today we're going to talk about two aspects of humans that I just want to emphasize at the beginning here. That one is that there are no biological races. We are all Homo sapiens sapiens or Homo sapiens. So we will talk a little bit about ancestry later, and I just want to emphasize this point here. And we also will be talking a little bit about the biological sex that you can determine on skeletons. And I just want to emphasize here that this is also a contentious part of the biological profile, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm trying to get at later. But just want to emphasize that there are still some difficult topics in biological anthropology and in forensic anthropology specifically. So if you have questions while I'm going over any of it, please absolutely don't hesitate to kind of raise your hands, and I'd be happy to have a discussion. And the one other thing that I really want to emphasize here is some of the ethics of working with human remains. So when I decided on this path of studying forensic anthropology, I had a professor, talk to me and say, why? Why do you want to study bones? And what gives you the right to study bones? And she said, you really need to think about that. Because we have to remember that when we deal with skeletal remains, we are working with the remains of once living people. And so my biggest mandate with any lecture that I give is respect. It is of utmost importance to me that we respect the bones that we work with, that we respect their story, and we respect the individuals that they are. So what that involves is proper handling, but also some confidentiality. So I will talk a little bit about a couple of cases that I've worked on, and the only reason I can't talk about them is they're solved. If they were still ongoing, I wouldn't be able to kind of talk about them. So confidentiality is another really big important aspect of the forensic part of biological anthropology as well. Another really important part is repatriation. So the importance of, has anyone ever heard the term NAGPRA before? Yeah, I hadn't either. But basically, it's a really important movement in biological anthropology to return remains to their, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, to return remains to their ancestors, to the folks that are the best curators, for lack of a better word, of those remains, are the folks' ancestors. So repatriation is really, really important. And then a couple other things, so ethical casework, right? So looking at expert witnesses and that confidentially and respect again. So just setting the stage for the lecture here. The images that I have included are not from real cases due to confidentiality, but we will talk about a couple of cases in which forensic anthropology has played a really impactful role. Really quickly, a lot of people often confuse forensic anthropology with bioarchaeology. So bioarchaeology is looking at things that are old. So typically 100 years old and older would be classified under bioarchaeology. This is also a subject that really focuses on population trends. So looking for, let's say, for example, this is a picture that I took when I was at Stonehenge. And they were looking at, so right now on the screen is just a partial skeleton. And they were trying to figure out what the people who were buried around Stonehenge were like. It wasn't just about this individual on the screen here, it was about the whole population of individuals and the whole time frame of the people that existed at this time. Another example, when I was in Greece, this individual was about 6,000 years old at a museum. And once again, the museum wasn't focused on this individual, but was looking at where did this individual fit in the picture of the society in which this person lived. So that's bioarchaeology. Fascinating stuff, very interesting. But we're here today to talk about forensic anthropology. So while bioarchaeology, all of these different ways of saying it, looks at the population level and looks at individuals and populations older than 100 years old, forensic anthropology looks at recently deceased individuals. Typically, no later really than 50 to 70 years ago. So that's what's classified as recently deceased. The other thing that it really focuses on is criminal investigations. So forensic anthropologists do research, but they also work closely with the RCMP and the medical examiners to actually work on active cases. Some of the things that can be involved in this process include field searches, but also forensic anthropologists are involved in things like recovery of human remains after mass disasters or human rights violations, and actually identifying if something is even human in the first place. We'll talk a little bit about that when I go through kind of the steps of forensic anthropology. And there you go. This is the big five. The big five questions that we ask as forensic anthropologists. And you might laugh that the first one is it bone? But that can actually be a little tricky to discern when you're working, especially in archaeological populations. So the first thing a forensic anthropologist asks is what I'm looking at? Bone. Okay, if we've established that it's bone, the next thing we do is ask, is it human? We then figure out if it's worth the forensic anthropologist looking at or if the bioarchaeologist can step in. So how long has this individual been dead? How many individuals are there? And then finally, who is it? So this is an overview, and we're going to touch on each of these facts briefly so that we can spend a little bit more time looking at some casework. So, is it bone? So the picture on the left here is of, or I guess you're right, is of a collection of assortment of things. And you might look at that and go, are those bones or are those rocks? Okay, now I'm about to tell a bit of a weird story here, and bear with me. I want to preface this story with, one would never do this in forensic anthropology. However, in bioarchaeology, if you are faced with a fragment and you're going, I just don't know, it's covered in a little bit of dirt, is it bone, is it a rock? Any guesses on how you can tell? It's a little out there. Yes.
Weight?
Great question, or great answer, but not weight. Yes.
Oh, it's like density of
You get close. So I guess weight's kind of close. Density, kind of. Yeah. Sometimes sound. Anyone last guesses? These are all things that would point you in the right direction, but the thing I'm looking for is a really quick and easy way. If you don't want to kind of weigh it, if you don't want to like worry about density, you lick it. And I'm getting some strange looks, and I know. Like I said, you don't do it in forensics, ever. But in a bioarchaeological setting, if you're really uncertain, if you touch the tip of your tongue to the bone and it sticks, it's bone. It doesn't stick, it's a rock. And you just licked a rock. I'm getting some strange looks. Don't worry, I've only ever done it once, and I did it in an archaeological setting. But if you're like, oh my gosh, Alex, absolutely, no way, that is the weirdest thing I've ever heard of. Yes, you can look at density. Yes, you can look at the sound it makes, especially with the tools that you're making. But the other thing you can do is you can look at it microscopically. So this is a picture of what a bone looks like under the microscope. So don't worry if you decide to go in this field, you are not required to lift bones. It's not a requirement. So yes, that is what it looks like under the microscope. And this is going to come back a little bit later when we talk about if it's human or animal. So is it human? I forgot to hide that. I was going to ask folks what they thought the most commonly mistaken animal bone for human is. It's a bear paw. And once again, you're probably looking at me like, what are you talking about? Bears have claws. Well, in a disarticulated, so that means when the skeleton's kind of been separated over time, if the claws get separated from the hand of the bear, if you look at the picture here, you can see it's kind of similar to that of a human hand. So forensic anthropologists are very often asked, is what I'm looking at here a bear paw or a human hand? And it can be really hard to tell. And you might end up looking at it under the microscope. And so here I've got a picture with what human bone looks like, and then animal bone, yes.
The human looks like it's got less of a sort of a thumb or part of the wrist, or
Yeah. So what we're looking at here, would it be helpful if we broke it down a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is actually your wrist. So these are called your carpal bones. So these are what make up kind of the part of your hand that bends. And there's about 8 of those bones. Right above it, so what makes up the palm of your hand are called your metacarpals. So those are these ones here. Oh no, I just almost switched it. See, I haven't used one of these in a while. So these right here are your metacarpals. So that's the palm. And then the next 4 here, so all of those, or 5, sorry, those are the first of your actual fingers. So that's the first part of your finger there. And this is actually an abbreviated hand because if you look at your own finger, right, you've got lots of bending going on there. What's in the picture here is just the first bone of your finger. You then have a second bone and a third bone, except your thumb. Your thumb only bends once, it only has 1 additional bone. Does that help to kind of put it in perspective a little bit? Perfect. Yeah. So under the microscope, we can see in the top one that's human, the cells that make up human bone are circular, they're round. Whereas in an animal bone, they're more rectangular. So that is a way that you can tell if you're looking at human versus animal bone. Any questions about that? Awesome. Okay, so how long has it been dead? So we have a graphic image coming up. It is of pig remains, so I just want to give everyone a heads up about that. But how long has it been dead is the decomposition cycle. So I'm going to change the slide so everyone just be ready. We as forensic anthropologists, we're not involved in steps 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's when the medical examiner is involved in the process. So that's when there's still a lot of remains still on the bones. We come to the pit scene if remains are found around step 5. There are some very interesting experiments. That's not the right word. Research, that's a better word, about the decomposition cycle. So has anyone ever heard of something called the body farm? Yeah, you've heard of it?
It was on bones.
It was on bones, yes.
So they used lizard food for the re-decay?
Yes. So if you haven't seen Bones and you're like, what is a body farm? It is a research institution in which individuals who've donated their bodies to science are actually put in different conditions, and researchers study how their bodies decay over time. So very interesting or gross, depending on what kind of interests you. But where forensic anthropologists would come in is just when the remains are skeletonized. Okay. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Do you guys do like above ground stuff, like with
Oh, that's a great question. So you're talking about something called ground penetrating radar. Yeah, so I personally have never been involved in ground penetrating radar. I have been involved in field searches. Typically I think it has been used, but typically if remains aren't buried very deep, they will become unearthed and scavenged. And so field searches are a more common approach used in forensic anthropology because things are on the surface. Yeah, but ground penetrating radar is very commonly used in archaeology and in bioarchaeology, and has especially been used, I believe, in this past summer for the discovery of the remains of residential schools. So it is a very important technology. Any other questions? Okay. So the next thing is how many individuals are represented. In a forensic sense, this is typically a little bit easier to determine. Normally, it's 1. However, my mentor, who's a forensic anthropologist in Edmonton, was called to, back in 1994 or 1995, was actually called to help in the excavation of mass graves from the Rwandan genocide. And so forensic anthropologists can be called into situations of human rights violations in order to help to demonstrate that there have been violations of human rights. So in that situation, you would want to know how many individuals are represented in the grave. So how many individuals are represented is kind of the next question we ask. And now the fun stuff, or I find it very fun. The biological profile. What I am interested in and what police are interested in is, who is it? Who are we looking at? Because remember that forensic anthropologists are involved in active criminal investigations. So who are we looking at? And that's so important because we then can use missing persons records to try to solve these crimes and cases. So we're going to go through each one of these. So don't panic if you're writing anything down right now. We're going to go through those right now. So the first is biological sex. So I want to emphasize that biological sex is, I think, really a really important thing to consider, especially in terms of gender identity. And I really struggle with when police ask for biological sex and they don't consider the gender identity of the missing individual, as that is something that is very important to know for missing persons as well. So a couple things that we can tell based on skeleton for biological sex, though, they all kind of exist on a continuum. So if you're comfortable doing so, I'm going to get you to feel your own skull. And I want to preface this with, it's a continuum. There is no, like, if you have a certain bump on your skull, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. But we look at the general trends that exist on a skeleton to help us identify the biological sex. So if you're comfortable doing so, first thing, feel the back of your head. Do you feel a little bump there? Yeah, I have a really, really big bump there. Typically, though, that it is more of a trait of biological males. So that's something that we typically see in biological males. The next one that's really interesting, if you feel kind of right behind your ear, do you feel like a bump right behind your ear? So that's called your mastoid process. Once again, this is a trait that's typical of biological males, but like I said, it's all a continuum. Another one that we can kind of see on faces is the brow ridge. So this is typically a bit more pronounced in biological males, but a continuum. I remember I was once taking a hominin evolution class, and a large, it's called a supraorbital torus, or brow ridge, is actually a really common trait in ancestral humans. And there were about 6 or 7 of us in the class, and the prof was like, yeah, even some of you have really pronounced brow ridges. And I was like looking around like, oh, who is it? Who is it? And everyone was looking at me. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's me. So it's all continuum. It's all kind of traits, but they help us to point the face in the direction of missing persons. Okay. The other thing we can look at for biological sex is the pelvis. So this is something that I've studied, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end here, but is another really good indicator of whether or not someone is biologically male or female. Pelvis, by the way, is your hips. So if you're like, what is the pelvis? It's your hip bones. So you have 2 hip bones that come to join together to create a bowl or basin-shaped pelvis. And that's what it looks like. So right now I'm just showing you a couple different angles of the basin shape of the pelvis and what is considered to be a biologically female pelvis versus a biologically male pelvis. Any questions about kind of the differences? I could talk about like the different nuances, but I want to get to who is it? What was the age at death? Because I find this one a little bit more interesting. So, making an assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, everyone in here has lost a tooth? Did anyone else's parents like keep their teeth in like a weird plastic bag and still have them? Just might? No, I'm seeing a couple nods, yeah. Some of you might, after this lecture, access to this collection, go and look at your baby teeth, because most humans have this in common. We lose our baby teeth. We have 2 sets of teeth. When we're born, actually, we have these tiny little nubbins of teeth growing already in our jaws, and they erupt over time, and then they're replaced by our adult dentition. And this happens in a very predictable manner. The teeth that we lose, which teeth we lose, when we lose them, can all be predicted on a rate. And so we can use that to determine how old someone is. Now, who in here had their wisdom teeth removed? Anybody had theirs grow in perfectly normally? Yeah, the fascinating thing, your wisdom teeth are the last tooth to erupt. And it happens typically around, I mean, for me, I think I was 17, but it can happen as late as like 22, 25, kind of in that range there. But it's really interesting because some people, or I guess I didn't ask this question, was there anyone in here born without wisdom teeth, or only 2 wisdom teeth? So some people are being born without their wisdom teeth because they are no longer kind of functional in our dentition. But the reason why we are not evolving, everyone is not evolving to not have wisdom teeth, is because modern dentistry removes them. So it's an interesting kind of dichotomy between natural process of evolution and our interference through modern dentistry. But yeah, teeth are super cool. Really fancy word here, epiphyseal fusion. So it basically just means your bones, when you're born, you actually have closer to about 300 bones. And they come in these little pieces. So here, this bone that we're looking at here is called your humerus. It's your upper arm bone. So here we can see it at birth. There's kind of a long diaphysis or shaft of the bone. And then by 5 years, you're going to notice that there are 3 additional pieces. And so these are called your epiphyses. And these actually grow, and you can see that by about 16 years, they've fused to make your intact humerus. This is another thing that happens at very predictable rate. So we can look at that. So it's called Epiphyseal Fusion. You have about 206 bones by the time you're about, any guesses? How old are you when your last epiphysis fuses? Yes. Oh, I thought you were putting your hand up. Sorry. 19. Great guess. A little older. Oh, so close.
23 and a half.
Other way.
25.
25. Very close. Yeah, 25. You've got a little tiny bone that your collarbone, and you've got a little flake of a bone that just fuses right onto that at about 25. So we like to say that osteologically, so that you're skeletally, your bones, you're growing until you're about 25, and then you enter a period of stasis from about 25 to 30, and then you start to degenerate, which is just so pleasant to think about as I approach 30. And here's an example of degeneration. So your pubic symphysis is where your two hip bones meet. Over time, it slowly goes from looking like a nice kind of like billowy surface to like pitted and nodular and not so great. So that's one example of degenerative change. Your ribs do something very similar. So they start off kind of billowy. And this is the best one right there, like the billow. And then as you age, so this is about 80 years old, you can see that they've created like a deep V or cup shape. And that's just kind of wear and tear over time. But this is what people are probably most common with. So on the screen here, I've got a picture of your vertebrae. Does anyone, vertebrae are, yeah, the spine, the bones of your spine. That doesn't look very comfortable, does it? There's a big spicule, a bony spicule growing up off the bone. So has anyone ever heard of arthritis? Yeah, it's something that many people do unfortunately have to live with. And so arthritis is a type of degenerative change, more common in older individuals, and where your bones grow spicules and they grind with other bones and it hurts. It's not fun. It's not fun at all. So here we've got an example of really bad arthritic growth on a part of your spine. And then here we have a part of your femur, so your thigh bone. You can see some bony growth kind of on the head of your, so this would be causing pain in your hip because that part of the bone sits in your hip to make kind of that ball and socket joint. So just imagine having growth in there. That would be very uncomfortable. And then this is a very common of knee pain. So that is the top of your tibia. Your tibia is your shin bone. And so that would probably be met with bad growth on your femur. And the two of those cause bad knee pain. So hopefully no one in this room has to deal with that or is dealing with it currently, but unfortunately it is something that many individuals do face is arthritis. Stature, this one is the trickiest one almost in biological profile. Who here lies about their height? Who maybe adds a couple centimeters here and there? Yeah, okay, I've seen a couple honest ones, thank you. Yes, many people aren't very truthful about their height on the driver's license, and that's what the police have to go off of, is kind of the record of missing person. And so, unless there's like an official doctor's record saying how tall someone is, and someone says that they're 6 feet, and then we look at remains and estimate them as 5'10", we don't want the police to eliminate that person from their record, so we always give them a plus or minus range to kind of encapsulate a little bit of room for wiggle. Stature is also really hard to estimate from bones because you have a lot of soft tissue, especially in your spine, and that adds height. And so when we just have bones, we have to include corrective factors in the calculations to estimate what the spongy material would be like in real life. So stature is a little tricky. Ancestral Infinity. So this is what I was kind of talking about at the very beginning, that I really want to emphasize there are no biological races. This is a part that is a really dark past of biological anthropology, and it's really unfortunate that it is part of the narrative that past researchers have used differences in the skull to put forth very wrong narratives that there are different races of humans. It's really tricky as a forensic anthropologist because the police want to know biological race, and we have to tell them that that's not a thing. that we can't tell you that. So I included it here as an important point to pause and say that variation is normal in the human skeleton, but we are all Homo sapiens, we are all humans. So really tricky part, because the police or our CMP officers may want to know information that we cannot provide them based on their skeleton. Okay, this is the cool part. Individualizing features. This is the part about the story of bones. Cavities. Anyone in here who has had a cavity, had the dental x-ray? I think maybe one person didn't put their hand up. That's great. I want to know your secrets because I have many cavities. But your cavities exist in a specific location on your teeth. The dentists have records of that exact location, size, everything. And that makes you you and different from everybody else in this room. So very powerful. There are actually people who just study teeth. They're called odontologists. And there's a forensic odontologist, and I'll talk about him a little bit later when we get to the mass disasters, because he was actually involved in identifying remains after the tsunami in 2005. So all based on teeth. Broken bones. I saw a couple of people have broken 5 bones. I like to brag that I have a very identifiable skeleton. But where you broke your bones, how you broke your bone, how old you were when you broke your bone, all leave a unique mark to you. And if you've ever had an x-ray, maybe you thought you broke your bone, turns out you didn't, but you had an x-ray, the trabecular pattern. So if you look at this bone here, you can see all these kind of like striations or lines in the bone. So these are all also, they're kind of like a fingerprint of your bone. So if we find a random bone in the forest, no evidence of a break, but we are able to x-ray it and match it to the missing person who happened to also have an x-ray, and their match, that's a positive identification. So I'm not saying go get an x-ray, but if you have an x-ray, it can be useful in positive identification. Pathology. So this is where things kind of go a little wrong with your skeleton. So, for example, abscesses. Okay, abscesses. So this is the picture right here. If you don't get a cavity treated, it can turn into, I think, a root canal. I don't know the quite direction. And then that can turn into an abscess. Very painful. And if it turns into an abscess and that's not treated, it can actually turn into an infection in your bloodstream. So they literally leave holes in your jaw. Periostitis. Has anyone ever had a shin splint before? Like really bad shin splints? They're so painful. I absolutely hate them. If you get chronic shin splints, they actually can cause periostitis, which is a fancy way of saying porous or lots of little holes on your shin bone. And so that was another thing that we can identify. They also happened with infections. So children who have experienced malnutrition or infections actually get a specific type of periostitis on the bottom or the top of their eye socket. It's called cribra frontalis, and it's indicative of malnutrition. So really, and then these are healed fractures. They are so really bad rib fractures that haven't healed correctly. So they have all of these bony growths. So that would be really identifying. These are called, these are like little bony growths. I'll show you one in just a second here. These are, oh, I forget which one this one is. It's, I think, and skull boring, where in the past, this would be an archaeological individual, most likely, if there was pressure in the skull, they would drill in to relieve the pressure. Trephidosis? Oh my God. Thank you. Yeah. This is my little extra bone. I like to throw this one in here. I had him removed because he was causing a lot of pain. But this is just a unique feature. So little bony spicules and little extra bones that you might have in your body aren't necessarily bad. A lot of people actually have little extra sutural bones. So your skull, all your bones of your skull kind of like join like a zipper. Little extra bones appear in the zipper. Totally fine, not harmful at all. But this is just to show you I had a little unique little bone, but it had to be. So sometimes they do cause problems. But I thought this was so cool because I was learning about forensic anthropology about the time this got removed, and I was like, oh my God, I have an extra bone. I'm so cool. No one else really thought it was that cool, but that's okay. Okay, some graphic images are coming up. I'm going to be showing you some images of some trauma. So I just want to put the warning up that we're going to be seeing some images of some traumatic injuries to bone. So if that causes any distress and you do need to leave, I completely respect that. So gunshot wound analysis. This is something that I have worked on in cases before. The way that a projectile actually enters the bone, you can actually tell the entry versus the exit. There's a lot, it's very contentious. Some researchers think you can actually determine things like the caliber of the bullet. So a lot that you can learn from gunshot wound analysis. Stab wounds, cut marks, and chop marks. So I did a really interesting study on this actually where I tried to analyze if these three types of injuries can be determined on bones after they're burned or cremated. You can actually, which is really, really cool. But there are some people, and I'll go to the next slide here. There's this researcher, a forensic anthropologist in the States, who literally can identify over 40 different types of saws based on the specific way that they cut bone. You're probably like, Alex, when would you need to know that? It can be used in certain forms of dismemberment or something like that. So blunt force trauma. So blunt force is different than projectile. Projectile is high velocity in a small surface area. Blunt force is still could be high velocity, but over kind of I guess. How much time do I have, Kevin? How am I doing? Okay. Hopefully that makes you happy and not sad that I have lots of extra time to do. Other strange characteristics. Telling if a bone is broken before or after the individual is deceased is another really tricky part of forensic anthropology. So this crack here, is this a fracture around the time of death, before the time of death, or after death? And that's a question that we forensic anthropologists do have to try to address. Taphonomy, how has it changed since death? So animal scavenging, so kind of to the question about if we use ground penetrating radar, and I said, well, often the bones are scavenged and scattered. Different animals leave different marks with their teeth on bones. Rodents use bones as a part of the process of filing them down, like gnawing. They don't consume the bone necessarily, and they leave different types of marks than, say, a carnivore, a coyote. Got lots living by my house, and they would leave more of a puncture mark in the bone. So here we can see images of gnaw marks. These kind of slightly lighter colors here are striations of gnaw marks. And then here, this is actually carnivore scavenging, because normally this bone would have a big protrusion like that, like a big round protrusion, and then more here, so that the scavenger has consumed the or broken that off to consume the marrow of the bone, and the marrow is kind of the inner cavity of the bone. Burning. So the forensic anthropologist that I work really closely with, her specialty is cremation and cremated remains. So they go through a pretty elaborate process and they change. And the biggest challenge, any guesses what the biggest challenges with cremated remains based on this picture? Yeah.
Figuring out what's what?
Exactly. What's what? You can get a big pile of bones like that and try and figure it out what's what. Very challenging. Yeah, very challenging. Minimum number of individuals becomes very hard and very important, especially in the cases of house fires. So it can be very challenging work. Weathering and soil discoloration. This is another thing that helps us determine if remains are really old, really old being over 100 years old. They tend to adapt the color of the soil, so they'll become more brown or red or whatever kind of soil is around them. And then weathering. So weathering does become unearthed. Was that?
I think from the online books, yeah.
Yeah, then it becomes cracked and turns white from the sun bleaching. So something that we can look at. Okay, any questions about all of the intricate steps of how forensic anthropologists look at bones before we look at some examples? No one's completely grossed out. Awesome. Okay. Mass disasters. So, as I was talking about, I know a forensic odontologist who has worked in the earthquake in Haiti, as well as the tsunami in 2005. So, looking at identifying individuals. So, we've been forensic anthropologists have been involved in mass disasters. And this is often what we look at. So here we're seeing commingles, remains, very confusing, and this is the end goal, a fully articulated individual skeleton that can then hopefully be identified. It's very challenging work. Past mysteries. So I've said all along, bioarchaeology looks at old and forensic looks at new, but sometimes they like to bring us in to look at specific individuals. So who here has heard of the Franklin expedition? Okay, one or two people. So I am not an expert on this. I'm going to try to bumble through this. Long time ago, they were trying to find the NorQuest Passage, which was through the Arctic up in northern Canada. They were trying to find a path for trading, I think. Anyways, ship went missing. No one knew what happened. Well, a forensic anthropologist team, Owen Beatty, he used to be a professor at the University of Alberta. And he actually has written a book about the Franklin expeditions. Check that out if that's really interesting. But they found graves, like marked graves, and they excavated them. So graphic image coming up of mummified remains. Okay. So the remains were actually really nicely preserved because of the permafrost, and they were able to actually do a lot of forensic analysis on these remains and put forth the theory that lead poisoning was involved in the reason why the voyage was unsuccessful. So really cool stuff that came from kind of past mysteries. Okay, so now on the present. Okay, so this one is a case that we probably know of, or maybe not, unless everyone else watches murder documentaries on Netflix all the time. Anyone heard of Jeffrey Dahmer? And nuts. Forensic anthropologists were involved in this case because Jeffrey Dahmer had stored human remains in his home. And so when his home was apprehended, forensic anthropologists were called to help in the identification, organization, and the case. And so if you ever look up Jeffrey Dahmer forensic anthropology, you can learn a little bit more about that. Now, who here has watched, oh no, it's escaping me, Stephen Avery, it's on Netflix. What's the documentary called, anybody? Oh no, I forget what it's called, but there's a huge documentary on Netflix with this individual called Stephen Avery. Long story short, a reporter went to his house, went missing. They later discovered human remains on the property. But, pardon? Is it called Making a Murderer? Yes, it is called Making a Murderer. Thank you. And he said he was innocent, so on and so forth. Well, interesting documentary. I've only seen season 1, can't speak to season 2. But forensic anthropologists were involved as they found cremated human remains on his property. And they were called in to help to prove if Stephen Avery was guilty or not. So you can look a little bit into this. This is quite a known case in the States. So if you want to learn a little bit more. But the one that I want to cover is a case that I've actually had the opportunity to work on. And it's Alberta's own mystery. And I'm so excited to say it actually has been solved, which is just so incredible. In the 70s, in Tofield, Alberta, a man was found brutally murdered and tortured in a septic tank in the 70s. And they could not identify him. They did not know who he was. I did work on this case as a consultant. And this past January, he was identified. They ended up using DNA. And you might be saying, Alex, why don't they use DNA every single time? It's expensive, it's destructive, and it doesn't always guarantee a match. This is actually, so the picture here is a facial reconstruction that they put out to the public based on his skull. and this is the individual. So it's very interesting. There's a news article that you can look up. This is maybe the Edmonton News. I'm not sure. This might not be a surprise to people about this case, but very exciting for the folks who have worked on this case that he was identified and his remains were able to be returned to his family. Has anyone heard of the Douglas Garland case? Hearing some nods. Seeing some nods. This is another case that I worked on, and so I can talk a little bit about it today. So it was a case in which an individual murdered a couple and child, and there were fragmented remains, and they were sent up to the forensic anthropologist in Edmonton, and we were able to look at them under the microscope to determine if they were human or not. So this is another case that you can take a look at if you want to see forensic anthropology in action. I can talk a little bit about it today because it is one that has been solved. So maybe I'll share this link with you and you can, but there are 421 long-term missing persons cases and 49 cases of unidentified remains in Alberta. It's a lot of individuals. And so it's really important work that forensic anthropologists are continuing to do and continuing to try to return these individuals to their families and give them an identification. So I'll get that news article to you, but the forensic anthropologist who I work under is in this global clip. So definitely would recommend checking it out. In the future, okay, so now I'm going to lose a bunch of you because I'm going to talk about my research, and I'm sorry it's not very exciting, it's kind of boring. I put a meme in there just to like get it a little bit more exciting. Okay, this is part of your hip. Remember I was saying you've got two of them and they come together to create kind of that basin shape? I don't look at the hip, I don't look at one of these, I look at, look at this, just the crest of one of these bones. So the reason they're in three colors is because when you're born, your hip actually has three different bones. Your ilium, your ischium, and your pubis. And they actually fuse together to create that. One is called an innominate, and then they come together to make your hip. It's a very kind of convoluted process. And I got really specific in my master's, and I looked just at the crest here. Now I'm showing you a bunch of like scary graphs. This is what I hoped my research would look like. And it involved doing a lot of this, so taking 3D scans of bones and turning them into identifiable individuals, or what's the word, not specimens, the word is escaping me, but turning them into individual entities that I could look at. And then, I don't know if you can see, that is all code. So here's my name. Yeah, it's very confusing. It's very, very confusing. But all of the coding and all of the making 3 models, that's what I was looking for, turn into something like this. So my research, I spent hours putting little dots on the crest of the ilium. So why did you do that? Because we could actually use that data to do analysis of populations. So in the lovely introduction from Kevin, I studied, so my master's research was not forensic based, it was more bioarchaeology. And I looked at a population of hunter-gatherers in Indian Knoll, Kentucky, and South Africa. And I was trying to determine something called plasticity. So I've talked about how your bones tell your story. Well, they also are very adaptable and flexible, and they change based on your growth and your health. And so I wanted to see if we could see differences in these populations based on their hip bones. This is a very, I hope you can kind of see this is very all over the place. If you can't see the different colors, they're not nicely grouped. They're all over the place. They're all scattered. The shapes are all scattered. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. You're probably like, Alex, why do you even care about this? Oh, no, I went too far. Because my long-term vision is that we can use non-destructive methods of looking at hips to identify deceased individuals in the forensic record. So long, lofty goals to basically be able to do something like this and use it to look at people's life histories and look at what they experience in their life. So kind of a last little where in the future, where I'm hoping to go. I'm hoping to be more involved in those 400 cases of missing individuals, and hoping that as forensic research continues to progress, that we are able to identify more of those people and solve those cases. So we shall see. Thank you so much. I hope that you found this a little interesting and learned a little bit more about one of the many subfields of biological anthropology.